Before we start the meeting, I'll read out the emergency evacuation announcement. Should we be required to evacuate the building, would you please leave the building via the hall entrance doors, turn right, walk straight past the canteen and through the external doors on the right and out to the car park, which is our assembly point. Please do not delay your evacuation to collect any belongings. Please do not return to the building until given permission to do so by council staff. Please note that this meeting will be audio recorded. Would you please switch off your mobiles or turn them to silent? Members, there are 4 microphones on the tables for use during the meeting. Please pass these to each other as necessary during the meeting. When I invite you to speak, please wait until there is a microphone in front of you before speaking, as the microphones are needed for the hearing loop and for the audio recording. Please use the hand gel and antibacterial wipes on the tables if you do touch the microphones. Members, voting will be done on a show of hands in line with the Constitution, and I will ask for a show of hands for and then against recommendations. Those abstaining from the voting will be noted by officers. Members, before we start the meeting, I hope you would join me in sending our thoughts to the people of Ukraine at this difficult time. And I hope that there will be a speedy return to a just peace in their country. Thank you. Moving on to the agenda. Agenda item 1, apologies for absence. We've received apologies from Councillor Robin Dray, Councillor Ian Foster and Councillor Eileen Gadsden. Agenda item 2, substitute members. Councillor Bob Milne is substituting for Councillor Dray and Councillor Julie Gooding for Eileen Gadsden. Agenda item 3, non-members attending, Councillor Simon Woodson. Moving on to agenda item 4, minutes of the meeting held on the 8th of February 2022. Members, are the minutes agreed? Agreed. Thank you, those are agreed. Agenda item 5, to receive declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest, members? Sorry, Councillor Newport.
Thank you, Chair. I think there's one item on the agenda which is Cctv, and as a member of Raleigh Town Council, I may have an interest in that item.
We'll move on to agenda item 6, which is the Community Safety Partnership. Welcome to Councillor Williams, the portfolio holder for the community, Inspector Calder and Louisa Moss, Assistant Director, People and Communities, who have joined us this evening for this item. Councillor Williams, can I invite you please to introduce the update on the work of the Community Safety Partnership?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman and members. This report updates the committee on the delivery of the joint Castle Point and Rochford District Community Safety Partnership over the last year and outlines the draft priorities for 2022 to 23. The small amount of PFCC grant monies received continue to focus on partnership projects that we know work and the Young People Programme, i.e. Walk Online and Crucial Crew, have now successfully adapted to the online delivery, which is more flexible for the schools and has increased attendance across all years. This year, Crucial Crew was delivered for the first time online and focused as one subject only, so as to reinforce messaging on what the partnership knew was a topical issue, i.e. tackling issues of exploitation linked to county lines drug supply. You will note the partnership draft priorities remain, in part, the same for next year, with noticeable addition of domestic abuse and violence against women and girls. As we know, there is a lot of work ongoing nationally and across Essex to progress this agenda. The Essex Safety Advisory Group that the partnership sits on has only just released its priorities, and Essex Police are also in the final stages of their draft strategic approach. So over the coming months, the Essex Community Safety Network will work together to ensure consistency of approach and incorporate actions into delivery plans as they emerge. I will now hand over to Inspector Calder, who will no doubt update us on the latest policing figures for our district and reflect on how partnership has worked from her team's perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure I need that, but I'll do it anyway. Thank you, Councillor. And thank you, Chair. So good evening, everybody. It's lovely to actually see you again this year. Not so nice for me last year when we were on Teams. I've had a look at the statistics in line with the priorities from last year. And I'm going to focus in the main on antisocial behaviour. What a funny time this has been. It's had a real impact on our statistics. You'll be aware that Essex Police at the moment have a high harm agenda. So I know that I've been in contact with a number of councillors and a number of people in the districts around the work that we're focusing on at the moment. So it is pertinent that we look at violence against the person, and looking at the Rochford data, it would be fair to say that we have had an increase in offences that sit under violence against the person. What I'm not going to do, and what I'm not able to do, is dissecting those figures is actually really difficult to do because there are so many different offences that sit under there. As an example, stalking and harassment sits under that banner. And so what we did do is a piece of work a couple of months ago where we found that, and this was done in consultation with the CSP, where we did a piece of mapping, and the mapping revealed that there was approximately, and I think I'm right in saying, 46% of those violence against the person crimes were around, and forgive me if that figure is slightly inaccurate. I know I've got the details here and I'll have a look at it in a moment, but around that figure was around domestic abuse. And that seems like a really high figure. That is a figure that we do have a specific team that focuses on for the whole of Essex and for our area. So I'm not going to focus on violence against the person other than to say it is the main agenda that Essex Police are focusing on at the moment because of the level, the increase around violence. That's force-wide, and we have seen some quite horrific offences throughout the force. But I don't know if there's anybody that wants to ask me any questions just about violence in the first instance. Mike? Sorry, Chair. I'm not very good at this.
You've indicated.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I said I'm not very good at that.
Thank you. Not Julie. I'd just like to say that we have noticed the antisocial behaviour locally to where we are, and I've had a brilliant response from police, and they have been on it the very next day and continuing to visit places and areas that I've experienced that. So thank you and your team that have done a brilliant job, because it has broken down what was becoming a gang to collect and thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Wilkinson.
Thank you, Chair. Kathy, the offences against the person, you're saying there's an increase force-wide. Is that an actual increase, or do you think it's to do with changes in the way crime is recorded and changes in legislation?
And that was a real concern to me, bringing that to the meeting. The figures exist, so I wanted to say that the figures are there, and they say that there has been an increase. But I actually do believe that there has been changes that have impacted on that figure. I can't tell you what the changes are in particular, but I do believe that that's the case, because the increase is quite significant. I think the stalking and harassment and all of the offences that come around that are what's actually caused the problem, but I haven't done the fine-grained deep dive. Is that okay, Councillor Wilkinson?
Thank you. Councillor Myers.
I've done it again. I haven't finished, have I?
Good evening. It's just a quick question. You said you've looked at all the recent statistics you've got, but I tried to search the Essex Police website, and last available figures on there were from 2019. So there was nothing on there, but then I had a look at the House of Commons library statistics, and for knife crime, which appears to be one of the items on the list, although Essex Police puts it into a weapons category, which can be anything from like throwing a book at someone to hitting them with a machete, the actual knife crime has been listed in this thing, and it's actually doubled inside 3 years. The
For
cases
Essex Police.
yeah, from the Essex Police District, from 750 to 1,500 and something. And that was sort of why there was no figures produced by Essex Police in the last few years.
I'm 100% with you, Councillor Myers, on that one. The knife crime, it's really difficult to scan through our statistics to find the data around knife crime specifically, because what it generally is it will generally fall into a different type of offence. There may be an assault, it might be an offensive weapon, it might be so many different things. So actually to drill down and get that data is very difficult. What I would put that increase down to is Operation Sceptre. We've been running for a number of years now, and it does bring a focus around knife crime. So I think that there has been some, I think the public engagement around knife crime is a lot more now than it ever used to be. So I actually think that's why we know more about knife crime in our communities. Does that make sense?
I just wondered why the Essex Police hadn't published anything for like 3 years, really.
So my understanding is there is a website, police.co.uk, and that has, whether it has fine-grained detailed statistics, but it does give you information about crime that's happening in your area. So that's where we ask people to look now when we're
the only problem with that, the statistics have all been bunched together into weapons, haven't they? There's nothing that says like knife crime or anything like that. You've either got weapons, which covers everything, as I say.
Yeah.
Anything you want to pick up becomes a weapon. So
I shall take that
it's
back.
just nothing specific, that was all. So.
No, but none of my data has specific knife crime on it, so I'm not able to give you that information.
Okay.
I was going to follow on with ASB stuff because I have done a fair amount of research around antisocial behaviour, if that's in order. So I've looked up the dashboard around antisocial behaviour, and it talks about the last few years and in fact the last month. It was really interesting for me to see that antisocial behaviour, particularly in the Rochford area, has been top of Essex Police's list for this last month, and in fact for the month before as well, and it does have a significant amount of antisocial behaviour happening. I wanted to talk to you about the sort of work that we've been doing here. We have had quite a few incidents, as the statistics show, and we have an Operation Honduras where we are trying really hard to identify some local young offenders who have been causing us an amount of grief over at Cherry Orchard Way and Cherry Orchard Park, over at the airport shopping estate, and And so what we have done is we've already arrested 3 of the individuals, and forgive me, I'm not up to speed on whether they've actually achieved the 4th arrest because that officer wasn't on duty for me to speak to today. And we do have a file already together to go through to the courts on that. I think that since we've done this work, we have seen a reduction in the amount of ASB that's been reported to police. So I think we have had some successes there, but it is something that we are constantly working on. I'd like to reassure you we're also working in schools to try to educate our young people about good and bad behaviour, to try to steer them the right way. And in fact, on the 25th of April, I've actually asked for force support so that we can have a week in this district, in the Rochford, Rayleigh and Castle Point district. So I've got a whole week of support from the force, where I've asked that we focus on engagement, particularly with our young people, whatever that looks like, to try to steer them in the right way. So any ideas that you may have, please let me know. So we'll be working with youth agencies and partners and schools, as well as more wider engagement, just to try to encourage young people to go the right way. We have, our engagement has reduced in the last couple of years, as I'm sure you can appreciate, because of COVID, and we've really felt that. But I'm also really conscious that when we look at the statistics, it would appear that young people more often than not are our suspects when it comes to an amount of criminality. So I think we need to do something in both of those respects, and we're trying desperately hard to do that work. Any ideas, please let us know.
Councillor Milne, you're indicating.
Yeah, thank you. Only just occurred for a question here, actually, which probably Cathy could take back to the Essex Police. I noticed when we were dealing with our research into crime in Rayleigh for CCTV, we had problems even with Andy Parkman getting data from the Essex Police system. There seemed to be a difficulty. Is it Athena or something, your system? Yeah. And it occurred to me that something like the word knife is an entity. So if you've got entity-based records system in a police service, which is a modern system, as opposed to records-based, you can quickly get anything related to an area, knife, a person, an address, and so on, which makes it very easy for someone, an officer like yourself, to actually get that information you need. But we seem to find that again and again with this system, the analysts are bogged down in the work they have to do for the force anyway, and we don't get that up-to-date information. I mean, as a matter of research, perhaps we could bring back from this committee to the Essex Police to ask them if there's any sort of improvement. We're not looking for confidential information. It is really at a statistical level, but that would really help us out because and when we look at the published material that's online, it tells you roughly something's going on somewhere, but it's, it might tell you in the town, but that's about as far as you will get with it. We did manage to get some decent analytical material for Rayleigh, which we could not hang on to because we only had it for the meeting. Then we gave it to Andy to have it shredded because it's, you know, obviously it's restricted, so we can't have that. But there is an issue there, I think, and it's another council's already mentioned that this evening of getting that information and data. But we don't want to drill down too much, but it would help you as well if they thought about that. And I don't know if Athena seems a bit of an old system these days. It's not entity-based, it's records-based.
Yeah.
Is it new? Yeah, well, it should be entity-led records, not records-based, in which case it's easy to get the info, because I used to be into all of that. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, I'll have to apologise. I'm not an IT expert, so I don't really understand the fine-grained detail of how Athena does what it does.
All it is you're an entity, this building is, and when you search anything to do with a knife, you find it, and you find the area, and it's very easy to do. But we don't have that, and we don't get any kind of accurate information. But we do get a kind of overall picture, which you're giving us, which is very nice. But I can sympathise with you because when you want that information, it seems to be difficult to get in the system they've got.
Can I suggest it might be helpful, Councillor Milne, if you email
Yeah.
Yep.
and then
Yeah.
for her to take that up.
Yeah. Well, I'll do it through.
We can do it
Yeah, do it through the chair. Yeah. So it's only a question, so it's okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I thought it was my
Is that
hearing
me as well?
that's gone wrong. Yeah, I think we've turned the speakers up. Can you hear it now?
No.
Yeah. No, the light's on. It's definitely.
Am I?
Your names are taken. Wilkinson.
The only final thing that I wanted to just mention this evening is that drugs falls under antisocial behaviour quite often when it's recorded on our systems, and I know that's something that's particularly concerning to our communities as it is to us. You'll be aware that we have a number of, and I'll call them new teams in policing. We have an Operation Raptor who looks at county lines travelling out of Southend and Basildon, and they do Rochford and Castle Point as well in relation to county lines. And particularly in relation to organised crime groups, we have a team called the Falcon team who look at the organised crime groups for this district. We spend a lot of our time dealing and managing drugs-related information and incidents, just so that you're aware, because it seems to be a huge focus. I'm conscious that there was an article in the newspaper, I don't know what date that was, but about a location in Rayleigh. I was asked about that location before that article was put into the Evening Echo, and what I would say is we don't have any information from the public to inform our work on that one. So, you know, it says we're never doing anything. That's what it's suggesting. But I asked the press office to make sure that in that press article we did have information asking people to report stuff, even if it's online. And it was only to somebody I was saying today that they said, oh, we saw a vehicle doing something that looked suspicious. We didn't think we should bother telling you. And I said, well, You should, because you never know if that's the piece, the last piece in that jigsaw that we needed to connect them to something that's happening. It is with regret that if you do give us information, or anybody gives us information, we won't always be able to come back to you and say thank you and how useful it's been. But I need to just reassure people that if we don't know, we can't help. I'm not saying that everything that you report we'll be able to do something immediately about. It will depend on how much intelligence we already have. But drugs is something that we're spending a lot of our time because of the vulnerabilities involved, because of the risks involved. It is something that we're focusing on. So I want you to reassure you that that's happening. And that's all levels of drugs, from cannabis all the way up and through.
Thank you. A couple more members have indicated. Councillor Mrs Mason.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of aspects around the priority areas. With the Community Safety Partnership has been going for, I don't know how many years, but it's certainly a number of years. And each year you set priority areas. Now, I hear what you say about the difficulty in collating statistics with such wide bands, but I do think that when we're setting priority areas, it would be helpful to perhaps have some information on how effective those areas are, because if we're choosing priority areas and they're not effective, we need to know, and if they are effective, we need to know. And without some sort of data, albeit difficult to obtain, so I wonder if that could be looked at going forward so that perhaps next year's priority areas can be quantified in some way to show the effectiveness of the Community Safety Partnership. The other point that I have concerns about is the antisocial behaviour aspect locally. Low levels of crime, I believe, often lead to higher levels of crime. I've been aware of incidences where residents have reported low levels of crime, damage to property, attempted breaking and entry, vehicle things, with CCTV, with car numbers, with identification, and the police have never contacted the people involved or followed up on it. And that means that in future, they're not inclined to report, because as far as I appreciate you're saying you don't go back, but when there's something as clear as a CCTV footage showing someone's car number plate driving over property and a footpath and causing damage, then I would have thought that was something that could be followed up. And to the best of my knowledge, it hasn't been, and there was various other incidents in the same area, none of which, to my knowledge, have been followed up. And the general consensus, unfortunately, of the people now is there's no point in contacting the police. And that's not something we want to get across. We want to get across, as you say, that even if there is no ostensible outcome, antisocial behaviour, even in its minus form, should be reported. So I don't know how that's going to be overcome, but I'll leave that to you.
Thank you. So it is with regret, and it upsets me greatly on a very personal level, that the high harm agenda that was imposed by our chief officers earlier on this year, late last year, has taken over everything at the moment, and so that is very much our focus and the direction and steer of our chief officers. It is with regret that that can be to the detriment of some of the lower level crime that you're talking about. We do try, as the community policing team, my team in particular, do try to collate that information to see what the trends and difficulties are so that we can do something about them. I would urge you to, and forgive me, I don't know the details of the incidents that you're talking about. Please send them through to me and I'm happy to review them, but I do need to stress that resourcing can be a real difficulty for us.
These were sent to the local community officer. He has all the details, but I'll
Is that Warren?
Yes.
Warren's been off sick for a couple of months, so it's with regret.
It was prior to that.
Right.
But I can give you the details afterwards if you like. There's no problem.
Okay.
Thank you.
Councillor Constable.
He's been off sick.
Thank you. few years back, we used to have an officer in Rochford whose job was antisocial behaviour, and she was so good at her job that if the local youths heard she was in the area, they all went home because she would like snuff them out and come down on them big time. Is that something we are likely to see back in the area at all?
So you have town officers that patrol the Rochford area, and in fact they've been pivotal in the antisocial behaviour problems that have been happening around Rochford. But what I'm not going to be able to do is just dedicate one officer. I've been in post for, this will be my 4th year, so we must be talking about some considerable time ago that you're speaking of.
It was a few years ago, but
Yeah.
it wasn't that long ago that we still remember how well she did the job.
I think, and I can't remember who I was speaking with earlier. Just to reflect, when I joined, I had 25 officers on shift at Southend, and we also had officers at Westcliff, Shoebury. Well, that's a completely different world to the world that we're in today. Southend doesn't have 25 officers now to cover Lee, Westcliff, Shoebury, Southend. So resourcing has changed dramatically over the years, and that is because of the demand on policing that has changed so much. The vulnerability agenda, the mental health agenda, there's so many things that is expected of policing now. It's with regret I'm not going to be able to supply an officer just for the Rochford area. When you say came down on them, what does that mean?
Well, I've heard instances where if there was a youth that was causing problems, she would take them home to their parents, and the embarrassment of things like that, it soon put a stop to it because the parents were made more aware of what the people were doing.
We do that, particularly if we can catch young people on e-scooters, which is another bane of all of our lives, I'm sure. So it's another problem for us because people say, why don't you do more about e-scooters? And I'm going off piste for a moment, but chasing after an e-scooter just doesn't always work for us. So we actually have to catch them before they're actually scooting, because we can't just run them down. But we do that. But we can't do that. So we do take our young people home. It depends on the circumstances in which we find them. Yeah, we still do that. I just don't have one dedicated officer that's going to be able to do that just for the Rochford.
It was more of the fact that she knew her patch. She knew which, because she knew her area, she knew which people were causing the problems. And that's local policing, and that
Absolutely.
was something that was a very good thing in this area. I'm not saying just Rochford, but that can exist in all areas where the coppers used to know their patches.
Yeah, and so with the Op Honduras that I mentioned earlier, that's what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to understand who the young people are, who they're circulating with, so that we can know those individuals better, engage with them differently. I'm trying to explore. They were playing football behind the shops at the airport, and I said, well, why can't they use the football pitch over the other side of the roundabout? Let's explore how we can get them over there. So we're trying to explore, find out who they are, try to engage them in different ways. And that's all stuff that you just won't see us doing. I don't have one officer that does that. I have a team of officers, but they'll do it at different times. So I'm sorry, I can't give you one name, but they've got
That's
a
just fine. I'm just asking where we were with that.
Yeah,
Can I just say, I've got a lot of sympathy for Inspector Calder because a lot of these calls about resources are not hers to make. And I would suggest that perhaps in the next municipal year we might consider getting the Police and Crime Commissioner for Essex in to talk about the policing within the district. Okay, thank you. Councillor Mrs Shaw.
of course you can.
It's on. It's definitely on. Thank you, Cathy. I'd just like to say, with my ward, I had an issue with antisocial behaviour, and in my division for Essex, I also had a drugs issue. Reported it to the police, and it's been solved. So thank you very much for the work that your officers have done. They didn't come back to me. I didn't need them to come back to me, but the residents have come back to me and said thank you to me. So I want to pass that thank you on to you. Thank you.
Thanks. Councillor Newport.
Thank you, Chair. Cathy, At the town council, I know we pay for the Essex youth workers. Do they, and really just wanted to know on how much work the police do with Essex youth workers to try and reduce the level of antisocial behaviour, because I know that youths are, sometimes tarred, with the brush of a lot of them causing antisocial behaviour issues, and that's what we've seen sometimes in Rayleigh town centre. So is it something that council should explore more and try to put more resource into with that? Is it effective in reducing that, do you think?
I think it's effective. The youth workers don't always want to associate openly with the police because they want to build those bridges with the young people, which we totally understand, and we engage with them where they will allow us to. But we do have really good communications with them, and we direct them in to areas when we understand that there are particular problems, and they come to us with particular problems when they think that the police need to be engaged with them. So it was something that really concerned me during COVID, our young people, and I know that I was looking for assistance with that, so I'm grateful for all of their assistance in working with our young people. So I think it's useful.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Mrs McPherson.
Thank you, first of all, Inspector Calder, for coming along this evening. Can you hear me? You can't hear me.
I can hear you, but
Thank you, Inspector Calder, for coming along this evening. Obviously, we're here tonight to actually review the community safety partnership, and you are just one partner. So it's really appreciated that you're here attending. Antisocial behaviour. You mentioned around several cases that incidents that we tied down to the four incidents you mentioned earlier on. Just one thought, obviously that's a few incidents, but a small proportion of people causing them. If that can be put out in the public, that we can, I know that you're quite active with the social media, if we can get that out to people, because it's quite reassuring that even if the antisocial behaviour has gone up, if it's just caused by 3 or 4 people that you've already arrested, that's quite reassuring and reduces the fear of crime, rather than just looking at the numbers.
and it sends a message, doesn't it? So that's
The other thing is, when you mentioned that antisocial behaviour in our district has gone up, and I think it's one of the highest across Essex. Can you tell me, has community trigger been activated during any of those cases?
not to my knowledge. Sorry.
Just to confirm and to back up what Cathy said, no community triggers, as in also called antisocial behaviour reviews, commonly known as community triggers, haven't been activated this year at all. So. Personally, I believe we do. I mean, the community trigger is obviously a little bit of a last resort. I mean, its aim is to reduce ASB and solve it, and it's victim-led. There's a bit of criticism behind the scenes from groups whether it is truly effective. It was introduced some time ago now. I mean, our duty as local authorities and other authorities is to specify the process on our websites. They're quite explicit about that, which, as you know, we do, and points of contact, and which we do, and again, timelines. And it very explicit in the government guidance that the community trigger process is effectively the last resort, so you would expect people to go through the normal complaints process of their organisations, local government ombudsman, etc. So in summary, I believe we do, and as you know, it is explained individually to clients as and when they approach us.
Thank you.
point?
It refers to the loss of the police analytical capacity. I think that date's wrong actually.
Yeah. It's fine.
But it isn't that.
Well.
I was quite surprised that we haven't got a specific analyst, because they're the guys who are going to tell you your trends, what you're going to anticipate happening. So where are we with that?
Councillor Thurston, if I could answer that, and Inspector Corder might come in. The police do have analysts still. They haven't gone away. It's just obviously their capacity is slightly stretched and reduced. And in previous years, they have done this year, they map a lot of statistical data, and subsequently they used to put that data and refine it and put it into a strategic assessment document on our behalf as a partnership. This year, to put it bluntly, so you can just visualise, they've done all the data, but they've dumped it with the partnership. So our task now is to refine it, and that is a new task for the partnership, and they haven't really necessarily got the immediate skills to do that. So they're all working as a network to determine how they put together a strategic document with all the data they've got. They are still leaning on the analysts, but not as hard as they were before. But just to reassure you, the police analysts are very much still in place. They're just not supporting the partnership in the same way as they were before. That's not a negative, it's just a learning curve for us. So. Yeah, Crucial Crew hasn't changed, even though last year it was the first virtual online Crucial Crew. Exactly the same as previous years, it reaches across the whole of the district. So, and Crucial Crew in particular is being supported by the Essex Vulnerable and Violence and Vulnerability Unit, and it's in a theatre style now. So there's a bespoke film for young people, and subsequently then there's an interactive workshop. And as you know, it's aimed towards year 6. So, and it helps them transition with some sort of fairly, hard messages for their transition into secondary school. So, and Bar and Bus as well, as you say, reaches across the whole district. And as you know, probably, you've seen it in Rayleigh and Holbridge and others. So.
Thank you. And lastly, how do we measure, because there's sort of anecdotally how successful these are. How do you actually measure that success?
It's not really that easy with partnerships, as you know. I mean, yes, you can measure it in the way of how many young people have attended. It doesn't necessarily, to be blunt, tell you how useful they've found it. And we do surveys of certainly the young people that attend the Crucial Crew and walk online. It's quite a challenge to get it all back. And we do get some, comments about, yes, very useful, frightening and, things like that. But ultimately, the qualitative type data is quite difficult for us, and that is an ongoing, as we've recognised, risk. So the Bar and Bus, as you know from their website, publishes quite a bit of data themselves, and we, the Community Safety Officer, talks regularly with, for example, the Bar and Bus Chief Executive, and Crucial Crew is done as a partnership across the whole network. So you're not necessarily seeing some hard data here, you're just seeing some softer sort of outcomes from what pupils have said, but that is a challenge for us, getting that back from the schools.
Thank you. Does the online delivery of the Crucial Crew, has that got the same impact as the face-to-face that you were doing, or is it too early for you to gauge that yet?
I think in reality, in-person events are always going to get sort of more engagement, but, I believe the impact's been the same, the reach has been the same. We said earlier that, it's more flexible, certainly for schools, to adapt, and of course, you know, it reduces travel cost and things like that. So at the moment, we're hearing from the schools and the pupils that the impact is exactly the same, but, you know, in reality, we know in person is always going to get a slightly better engagement. But for the schools, this is working out extremely efficient way of getting all, this, you know, all their pupils engaged quickly, and saves a lot around travel cost. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, Chair, if I may, to Louisa Moss. Louisa, can you tell me the success of the J9 initiative, which helps victims of domestic abuse? As I understand from Kathy earlier, that it's a high area of concern. And have we seen much take-up of that? Because I do think during the pandemic, the rates rose in domestic abuse as well. Is that something that the council was actively promoting and trying to get businesses involved in? And then second question, can you tell me when the CCTV network will be implemented across the district, please?
The J9 program is, you know, a good question. I can't give you a detailed answer on that, and I'll get back to you. As you know, it's a promotion to businesses. It's not something we've particularly focused on greatly over the last year. Obviously, we have been working with our partners through the South Essex Domestic Abuse Hub and Compass, which is the Essex provider around domestic abuse. And we've been working with SETDAB, which is the South End Essex and Thurrock Domestic Abuse Board, to provide a consistent approach across all of our networks. So I will get back to you, Councillor Newport, with specifics around J9, but I can't give you those this evening because we haven't necessarily promoted that to businesses as perhaps well as we might have done, but it has been complemented by the other Essex-wide activity, and especially because the Domestic Abuse Act is now out, we've all been working collectively across Essex around that messaging. Around CCTV, and my only comment is that obviously that's gone through the working party, and relevant reports have been received by the Town Council, particularly Raleigh Town Council, and obviously you know, the Community Safety Officer is waiting to support them further based on their decision.
I think I'm alive. Can you hear me? I can never tell if this thing is on. Yeah? Okay. Yeah, if I could just, 3.7, if I'd like to focus on that page, scribbled over it, 6.2. Those are the draft priority areas. I'm assuming that they'll be firmed up at a later date. I'd just like to be noted that in October a motion was submitted by myself, Councillors Carter, Mrs Newport, Mrs Knight and Mrs Weston that proposed support for everyone to be safe from violence and harassment. And I do hope that when it's eventually heard at the council, they will support and implement the proposed actions to safeguard our residents. And this will support the draft priority areas of actions that you've listed here. So it's along the same lines, and hopefully that will support you as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. So I have great pleasure in bringing this report to you this evening, looking at the Council's disposal framework. Can you hear me now? Yes, that's better, isn't it? So thank you, Chairman, for letting me bring this report to you around the Council's disposal framework. I'd just like to bring members' attention to a couple of points, if I can. First of all, in Appendix 1, which sets out the framework, the disposal framework. And this is the four reasons in terms of we will look at and identify an asset as suitable for disposal and surplus to requirements if it cannot evidence how it meets at least one of the objectives outlined above. And the first of those objectives is operational. We need assets to service our office accommodation needs for our staff and partners. The second is financial, looking for assets to generate revenue, income and or for capital investment. The third area is around regeneration and development, looking to regenerate an area of the district. And the fourth is heritage, to promote the heritage offer for the local area. If our assets don't meet at least one of those objectives, then we'd look to dispose of them. The framework has proved very successful because although the assets, we may not need them as a council anymore, our community certainly does. And there's been some excellent projects that we've been able to do where those assets have gone to the community and have made a significant difference. And I'd like to draw members' attention to section 4.1 in the report, please. This is where we have applied the framework and we've been able to bring some of those assets back into the community. Particularly pleased with work that's recently been completed around Ashington Pavilion, where this is being leased now to Ashington Parish Council and to Ashington Preschool. The buildings themselves have been renovated, they've had new windows put in, a new roof put on. The building itself looks significantly better than it did a couple of years ago. And actually, in terms of the lease agreement, Rochford District Council now receives £10,000 a year for that property, which is an excellent piece of work. You also may be aware of the work that's going on at Crown Hill, the former public convenience in Rayleigh, the toilets there. This site is now will be refurbished and will be reopened. And I'm pleased to actually update members this evening that it's actually going to become a high-quality tap room supporting local microbreweries and run by an organisation called Craftwork Beers Limited. They're an excellent company that's got a good track record in Southend, and they're going to be using that former public convenience, and they're going to be refurbishing it at their costs. So again, a really good piece of news, seeing that investment in Rayleigh High Street with a new company coming in there. We've also got the work that's been going on in Hawkwell Pavilion with Essex Hack Space. Fantastic there, that work's been developed by the community and benefiting our community. So just a couple of examples there of where this piece of work has benefited our community, and we've been able to give assets back to our residents. There's just a couple of things that I would like to bring to the committee's attention. I've listed the 4 reasons that we're looking to dispose of assets. I do feel that we could be stronger around the environmental factors. I don't think we've been strong enough there, and certainly I think going forward, it's one issue that I'd like to see highlighted in this work, to give consideration to the environmental impact of our buildings. And certainly if somebody's to take on a building, I think we could be doing more to ask them to consider the environmental impact of their work. And finally, I guess going forward, there's a question mark over which pavilions should be looked at next, which assets should be looked at next. I think there's a feeling that we've done an awful lot of work within Rochford and Hawkwell, and some good work in Rayleigh. There's probably a need for Great Wakering now as well, I think, to look at some of the assets over there as well. Matt, did you want to jump in with anything?
Through you, Chair, if I may. Thank you, Councillor Webb, for the that really useful summary. Just to add to that, if it helps members, the framework is, I think, only one part of the process. As it sets out in the report, it complements the asset strategy that we approved in 2018, and also the lease policy, which we amended in 2018 similarly. So the 3 taken together, the disposal framework, the asset strategy, and the lease policy, are the 3 guiding principles of how we look at our assets from a point of disposal. The framework is before us this evening, but it's just important to note they do link together, and that is referenced in the report in terms of those objectives that Councillor Webb highlights. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd like to say some of the assets that have been coming forward have been an absolute godsend to our local areas. And I particularly have an interest in Hawkwell Pavilion. As you know, I've been supportive of it from the start, even suggesting it on one of our away days to get it brought back into use. And through the support of Councillor Wotton when he was on the assets, this has come into use, and it's been really well used. I have got some figures. Over 300 people are using this weekly, so it's been a great asset to the community. I just wondered if there is a policy in place on your asset strategy framework on the environmental impact. Do you have that? I didn't quite hear when you was talking, so I'm sorry about that.
Thank you, Councillor Gooding. It's a very good question. I think it's interesting how the world moves on in the past few years since we've written that framework. Councillor Webb highlighted environmental aspects of the framework going forward. I think that's something that we'd like to consider and discuss going forward. I think it's a gap in the framework. I think it needs to be something we can consider. When we look at disposals, we should now be considering how, if it is a disposal, how that, through the expressions of interest we use to identify potential new operators of buildings, how could they support us and the council's objectives towards our objectives of carbon neutrality and sustainability. So yes, it should be included, and I think going forward we'd like to make that happen.
Thank you, Chair. Just three aspects I'd like to comment on. We have such wonderful equipment. Can you hear me now? Right. There's just three aspects that I'd like to comment on this report. Firstly, Councillor Webb has said that he'll be looking at the environmental aspects to get that included in the framework, which obviously I think we would all support. Secondly, I'd also like them to look at the potential community value when they're looking at the disposal of assets, because I think that's something that is overlooked. We shouldn't just look at monetary values, we should look at values that perhaps aren't so easy to be measured. So certainly I'll support Councillor Webb with that, and hopefully he can ensure that the other aspect is looked at as well. The second item on 3.3 says the disposal of land is transfer of freehold or leasehold interest. I must admit I have concern with the council giving up freehold, because a freehold produces normally income. So I would just say that as a word of caution there. But the main area that I'd like some clarification on is under 4.1. The parcel of land off of London Road, the access strip to Rayleigh Town Sports and Social Club, they're suggesting a freehold sale. That piece of land is effectively a ransom strip. And should circumstances change, and we all know that with the planning situation, things can change quite dramatically, especially with a new local plan, that parcel of land's value would change dramatically. So are we going to put a retention on that land if we're selling it, to make sure that should it be used as a ransom strip, and therefore consequently greatly increase in value, that there is some benefit to the council? It's commonly done in commerce. I don't know if the council has ever done it before, but certainly I would be concerned at selling what is potentially a ransom strip. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mrs. Mason. In answer to that question, just to clarify, that parcel land has already been disposed of. A report to executive forgive me, I have to check when, late last year I believe, that already has been disposed of. In terms of rights across that land, they are maintained for the council and the sports club in perpetuity, but that asset has already been disposed of.
Yeah, the right of access, I accept. It was the use as a ransom strip, but obviously if it's being done. I thought this was an intention. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Mrs Mason. I certainly welcome your comments around the environment. I think that's long overdue, and that will certainly has been taken on the board already, so thank you for that. In terms of the community value of the assets, I would certainly welcome that. I think that's one of the strengths of this piece of work is where, for example, the pavilions have gone back into community use, and a comment from Councillor Gooding in terms of the number of people that are using that through Essex Hack Space is phenomenal. So I would certainly welcome that being included within the assets as well. I think it's a very sensible point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you for the disposal framework diagram, because it really does show a process. Actually, I call it a process chart that solves problems to do with this, because what I'm going to come to in the question is, obviously it caters for the 1972 Act, because smaller items that are kind of in the green zone officers can deal with, and then where the executive is involved, most of those are kind of, I would call them green and amber. But when we get into the red zone, and we have had problems with the asset delivery program, in the current one, where we look at in this chart somewhere, the risk assessment of something that might go into a red area that's going to cause problems with citizens and the community, which we have had, the risk assessment area there, we went for, as Mrs Mason said, a very efficient financial solution. It was almost like a machine. It was going to really deliver everything. And it has had some sticky points. So, particularly in this one, because my question is that the council engaged in a public consultation progress after entering into a partnership and legal agreements, and had the council considered using problem-solving and risk assessment techniques to define a model to follow inside of this, to follow in the disposal framework to avoid such situations? And that was my suggestion or question, because obviously this has been a learning curve, because we're dealing with social and heritage areas. And for most of what's in this report, of course, they're absolutely beautiful examples of asset disposal. And particularly with Rayleigh, we're particularly grateful to have the playing field, which has recently been signed over. So there's some really good work here, so don't get me wrong. But looking at a model to evolve this, because in the future we may encounter similar problems. I have a feeling that sometimes local government underestimates the abilities of the citizens and their involvement. So what I have done, I've actually, as a suggestion, sent to Councillor Wilson a suggestion for a little bit of a group to look at this, just to refine the model, yeah, in consultation with yourselves, to see if we can apply some of the techniques in problem solving to it, which you have already by actually producing this, which is all good stuff, you know. So I'm not a knocker of it all, right? Don't get me wrong there. So that's my question. So are you in favour of looking at that form of approach?
Thank you, Councillor Milne. I'd certainly welcome your comments. And if you wanted to set a working group up to look at this piece of work in more detail, I would welcome that and would indeed sit on that group and take note of your recommendations. So yeah, thank you for that contribution.
I'll be pleased to get involved, you know, so instead of sitting
I think you need to get involved, to be honest.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I refer to page 7.1, 3.5? I think there is an element already in the paper around assets and their social value for our community. What I would like to see under that 3.5 if there could be some sort of framework to actually measure the impact when community groups are taking on any of our assets that are passed to them under value. Then on page 7.7, it says around the disposal, the council will dispose of assets by tender, formal, informal, by advertising and inviting sealed bids. Perhaps the officer can explain where they're advertised, how widely, because often if we want to appeal to our local community groups, this has to be aimed and possibly even targeted at some of our voluntary groups. And lastly, and this could quite possibly be a recommendation, in the disposal framework procedure on 7.9, I cannot see any mention of when an organisation comes to us as a council showing interest on taking on one of our assets. Unless the officer wants to tell me that it's in there, I would like to recommend that it is included and some weight given to that. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Person, for the question. So in terms of, I think I'll take these out of order if that's okay, but if I miss anything, do let me know. In terms of how we market assets, I think it would depend on if we're looking at a commercial opportunity or, as Councillor mentions, a community opportunity. If we're looking at a potential commercial opportunity, we would work with a local agent. So in the past, we've worked with, what you would have seen as in Crooks recently, marketing the former Crown Hill toilets. So we would go through a formal commercial process, inviting expressive interest and bids to an agent and following, as you'd expect, a fully commercial process. If we're looking at a community asset, and Councillor Gooding mentioned the pavilion at Hawkwell as another good example. With those facilities, we look more at a more community-based approach, so it would be an expressions of interest, for example. So we would design a expression of interest form, which would include how the asset and the group could meet the council's objectives. So they may be around enabling communities and maximising our assets. So how would that group enable those objectives of the councils to be met? And we would score that, as you'd expect, on an objective basis. But also include other things such as their development plan, how can they deliver on those opportunities, and other things you'd expect to see in terms of safeguarding, health and safety, etc. So it's a more community approach to those types of events, groups, forgive me. In terms of the other question, forgive me, Councillor, just remind me. 3.5, thank you.
In terms of measuring the impact of the community groups, I mean, I think that maybe if we form a small working group, that's one of the things that we consider within that, I think, because that could become quite an extensive piece of work. But actually, in terms of some of the data we've got already, we've seen that through the Essex Hackspace example, where we've already measured the number of people using that pavilion. But I think if we could take that as part of the working group and give that some more thought, if that's okay.
Thank you. Just want to come back on one point there. You mentioned that it's decided whether the disposal of the asset goes to a commercial organisation to advertise it. Is that correct?
So the way the process works, we would, myself in consultation with 151 and the portfolio holder would identify an asset for disposal, and it's at that point we would make the decision whether we felt was it best, is it a community opportunity or a commercial opportunity. Depending on which of those we felt was the best option, we would then design the process around that.
Could I just point out, there is the Social Value Act, that community groups are not to be disadvantaged in any way. So, you know, you're almost ruling them out as opposed to advertising it widely so that both community groups can apply and tender for an asset that you have deemed to be commercial, but it may be a building that they would like to show some interest in.
I can certainly note that, Chairman, and consider that with the portfolio holder. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Mrs Mason.
Thank you. I was also agreeing with Councillor McPherson. It does seem a little concerning that we're starting off at the very beginning deciding which route to go down, when both of those routes could be equally valuable. And I think that's the point you were trying to make, isn't it? That we should keep an open mind on whether it's a community or commercial, and that decision shouldn't be made at the onset. It should be made further down the line so that community organisations have the advantage and aren't disadvantaged at the outset, which they effectively are. So I don't know if you want to put a proposal to that, Councillor McPherson, but I certainly second it.
Sorry, yeah. Can I ask a question myself? Because I've been listening to the debate, and it sort of ties in with what Councillor Mrs Mason and Councillor Mrs McPherson said, and it relates to paragraph 3.5. And the question I've got really, do we have a sort of scoring mechanism whereby we look to see if there are different proposals? So, for example, if there's a social proposal or a commercial proposal, is there some sort of algorithm or some sort of process that we go through to look to see which one we're going to go for? And if there isn't, I would recommend that there should be one.
Thank you, Chair. I think the simple answer is yes, there is. I wouldn't describe it as an algorithm. It's not quite as complicated as that. It's more, so working with the portfolio holder, we know what our, the council's objectives are in terms of our enabling communities and maximising our assets. And it may be that an asset can meet both of those, either or one or the other or both. So we do take a view and we consider that carefully. And it may be our approach from commercial and community groups that may wish to take on an asset. And if that is the case, we can have that conversation. We can undervalue an asset, dispose of it if it meets those objectives. And we can create, as we have done previously, scoring mechanisms that can enable us to quantify that and put that in a report so we can identify what that social value is. And it may be providing, as some of our assets do in terms of services to the community, and that may be how we can justify that or other means. So that's certainly something we do consider as part of that process.
Okay, thank you. No one else is indicating, so we had a number of recommendations that came up. The first recommendation was from Councillor Mrs Gooding, which was about environmental consideration. Would you like just to summarise what the recommendation is, please? So, Sonia, will you be able to put these up on the screen so that we can see them or not? Or I'll just read them out. Okay, yeah. Okay, thanks. The second recommendation, I think, was coming from Councillor Mrs Mason, which is looking at how we measure community value.
It was to add that as an aspect under the framework, along with environmental.
Does that mean social value, Chair?
Social value, yeah, sorry. How do we measure social value?
Community, I actually said.
But I suppose the question
You
is...
could put community and social, but I think community is actually more wide-ranging than social.
It's just that social value has a specific definition at government level and in terms of Red Book valuations.
In that case, if we put both in, then we're covered, aren't we? Thank you. Thank you for that clarification.
So which would the value, social value is?
Social value is... Thank you, Chair. Social value is the correct term.
Are you happy with that, Councillor Mrs Mason?
Not really, no. I'd like
We can put
community as
community
well.
and social. Then.
Yes, that's what I've asked for, yes, sir. Thank you.
I'll be honest, Chairman, if you don't mind, Councillor Mrs Mason. Social value does take in the community aspect, but it also can be the add-on. They may take in apprenticeships or provide services for us as
just preferred it to be wider, but if everyone else disagrees, then I'll go with that.
Thank you. The third recommendation was from Councillor Mrs McPherson, and that was around the marketing of assets.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. My recommendation would be that during the disposal of assets, our community groups are not disadvantaged in their ability and opportunity to bid for any of these assets. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, thank you.
I'll type it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll type it. It's on the flow chart. I mean, it's 5 minutes. Yes, please, Chair.
Members, while Angela's typing this up, we'll have a 5-minute comfort break. If that's okay.
That's fine. I'm not connected because I'm not, that's the issue. I just, you're going to just tether off of my phone.
Sorry, can you hear me? Right, I can sing my way. When they come back, come for break.
Okay, members, I'll read out the recommendations. Can you all see them? I'll read them out anyway. First recommendation is to include consideration of environmental and community/social value issues in the disposal framework. To ensure that during disposal of assets, community groups should not be disadvantaged in their ability to bid for assets, and that a working group be established under the auspices of the portfolio holder for commercial, business, local economy and leisure to consider the use of risk assessments to inform disposal options. Members, I propose to vote for those on block unless anyone... You want to take them separately? Okay. So Yeah, okay, thank you. So the first recommendation is to include consideration of environmental and community/social value issues in the disposals framework. Could those indicate in favour? Please raise their hand. Okay, that's unanimous. Thank you, members. The second recommendation is to ensure that during disposal of assets, community groups should not be disadvantaged in their ability to bid for assets. Could those in favour please raise their hands? Thank you, members.
Chairman,
That's unanimous. And
Chairman.
recommendation number 3, that a working group be established under the...
Sorry, Chairman. I'm just wondering if a standalone meeting that's task-orientated might be better than setting up a whole new working group, as I'm very conscious of officer time. Absolutely agree with the need to look at this piece of work, but would our review maybe consider a single standalone meeting rather than ongoing working group, please? Thank you.
That's fine. It's there. I understand what you're saying. I sympathise. But I think it's there. So recommendation 3 is that a working group be established under the auspices of the portfolio holder for commercial, business, local economy and leisure to consider the use of risk assessments to inform disposal options. Could those members in favour please indicate? Could those against please indicate? Okay, and no, so there were 9 for and 5 against, so that recommendation is carried forward. But bear in mind, this is a recommendation that's going forward to the executive.
Yep. Noted. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. So, members, there is one further recommendation, which is to note the implementation of the disposal framework since its inception. Is that noted, members? Okay, thank you. Item 8 is the key decisions document. Members, are there any questions on the key decisions document? Okay. Thank you, members. Moving on to item 9, which is our work plan. Members, looking ahead to the meeting on the 5th of April, we'll be in a position to consider a report from the Carbon Neutral Working Group. The stakeholder engagement item will be rolled forward into the next municipal year. So this was our stakeholder engagement. Sorry, Councillor Wilkinson, yeah.
Thank you, Chair. This is the meeting you asked me to remind you about our previous conversation around the planning enforcement.
Yes, thank you. So an issue has been raised about how the enforcement, this has come from a number of members across the district, about how planning enforcement is operating within the district. And what I've proposed to do is to put that, have a member-led working group on this, and to use that at the start of the next municipal year. So that will be added in for next year. Okay. So the background to this is that there are a number of cases that have been raised and brought to me about the perception that perhaps enforcement isn't being done on certain buildings. So buildings get planning approval, and then what's actually constructed isn't necessarily what was in the drawings. So it's a working group to look at how that can be taken forward. Councillor Mrs Mason.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There were other items, I believe, on here. Certainly there was the Outside Spaces Working Group that seems to have fallen off. And normally we leave those on there for the new review committee to consider in the new municipal year. That they seem to have got lost, but I believe from the last report there were 3 or 4 items that hadn't been incorporated.
Can you say which ones they are?
Well, the only one I can remember was the Outside Spaces Working Group.
The
Outside Spaces Working Group, historic.
Okay, we'll make sure that goes on then.
That hasn't gone on, but I believe there were some others, and I'm just going by memory, so I could be wrong, but perhaps someone else has got some old documents and can look them up.
Yeah. Sorry? Oh, that's better. Is that better? It keeps turning itself off. I don't know why. Sorry. Yeah. Right. I will look at that. Councillor Milne.
Yeah, just one issue, because unfortunately it's going back to the previous session before the working. I had a suggestion or a recommendation that we look at the model, because this model or the framework and the previous item 7 did not include a specified methodology for dealing with public engagements if we risk assess something that is really impinges heavily in the social or heritage area. And although there is a risk assessment there in number 3 up there, and I had actually written out a document about that.
Yeah, we can't go back on the item, but I will take an action to take your paper and present that to Matt Harwood-White.
Okay.
And I think your suggestion was that there'd be potentially a member working group on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's fine.
Okay,
That's
thank-
fine.
yeah,
I'm
it
fine
won't-
with that.
it's
I
not-
thought you'd forgot me. That was all.
Yeah, no, it's not being forgotten. Not being forgotten at all. And then an update. I gave an update at the last meeting, but I've had a further update from Louisa Moss about the homeless and rough sleeper strategy, and that will be ready around. The first draft will be ready around June, so we'll roll that over into next year, next municipal year as well. Okay. So, are there any other questions on the work plan, members? Okay, thank you, members. Just before we finish on that, I'd like to ask Angela Hutchins. She's going to give us an update on some of the reporting for the partnership programme.
Thank you, Chair. Members, just to confirm that following the full council meeting at the end of January, the Rochford and Brentwood strategic partnership work is commencing, and I should be in a position to bring a report to this meeting in June and to take in a report to executive at approximately the same time. So that will be the next item for your work plan. And the contents of that June report will discuss and set out the ongoing work plan for the remainder of the programme. So again, that will inform your work programme for the rest of next municipal year.
Thank you, Angela. Okay, members. No one else is indicating, so that's the final agenda item. So the meeting is closed at 2100 hours. Thank you.